Hello, welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Anurekha Chariwag, Assistant Professor, Department of Sociology, Savitribai Phule, Pune University. I am presenting this module on peasant studies in Indian sociology, Marxism and the agrarian question. This module is under the paper Agrarian Relations and Social Structure in India, which is coordinated by Dr. Manish Thakur, IIM, Calcutta. In this module, we are going to discuss the overview of classical origins of the agrarian question. We will focus on the Marxian tradition as it discusses. Also, we will focus on populism tradition, especially in terms of contending perspective. We will also focus on Marxian class analysis and agrarian populism, especially in the studies of peasantry. In the decades of the 1960s and 1970s, peasant studies in India got a major fillip owing to the great efforts of a number of scholars who were variously influenced by Marxism. Even though Marx did not have a charitable view of the peasants and considered them to be like potatoes in a sack of potatoes, other scholars belonging to the Marxist tradition paved the way for a serious scholarly engagement with the class of peasantry. Marx was critical about various aspects of rural idiocy and on the whole thought of peasants as a socially conservative and reactionary force. Yet the conditions in Russia and China in a way compelled leaders like Lenin and Mao to reflect seriously on what subsequently came to be termed as the agrarian question in the literature on peasant studies. In this module, we present a synoptic overview of the classical origins of the agrarian question in the Marxist tradition and its later extensions and modifications. We also talk about a contending tradition known as populism that had its origins in the writings of China. Thus, we introduce you to the two contrasting traditions of Marxian class analysis and agrarian populism in the studies of peasantry. Genealogy of a tradition. The agrarian question acquired a global political and scholarly attention after the communist leader Lenin's presentation of the preliminary draft thesis on the agrarian question at the Second Congress in 1920. It does not mean that there were no reflections on the issue earlier. In fact, Marx collaborated. Engels wrote the peasant question in France and Germany in 1894. Of course, Engels' concern was not with the peasantry as such, but with the exploration of enabling political conditions for a socialist revolution. Since peasants constituted the majority of mankind, it was but natural to look at in terms of interrelationships with differing political persuasions from the bourgeois and reactionary political parties to the socialist ones. One simply could not wish the peasants away from the reflection upon the order of the day. Given the sheer demographic presence from Ireland to Sicily, from Andalusia to Russia and Bulgaria, and the key role in production and political power, they had to be factored in for any political project of the day. It is important to note that Marx's engagement with peasantry started in an obvious political fashion and was seen as an important object of serious discussion and political program in many Western countries, including France, Germany, Italy, Denmark, and Russia. The later publications of two important Marxist tracts. Evidently, the agrarian question has been a political question since the day one. Also, the elaborations and delineations of the agrarian question have been different in different countries depending on their varying socio-economic and political context. During the 1890s, Germany was one of the industrially developed countries. Not surprisingly, the agrarian question has been inextricably linked with related issues of parliamentary democracy, socialism, revolution, and the like in the context of Western Europe to begin with. Once the agrarian question was made to converse with the then prevailing conditions in Russia, it acquired a centrality that it did not have before. It would not be wrong to say that it was a Marxist political project in Russia that accorded the agrarian question an unparalleled centrality in Marxist tradition and elsewhere. In fact, since the late 19th century, the agrarian question has been tied up with the politics of the day. For example, the rise of Social Democratic Party in the mid-1880 in Germany was of great consequence to the agrarian question. One does find rudimentary discussion of the peasantry and agriculture in the 1860s during the First International. The central debate has been around the question of ownership of land. For the Marxists, the nationalization of land was an utmost item on the political agenda. On the other hand, Prodhonas and Mulists were in favor of allowing peasants to retain their property rights. In 1867, the Lausanne Congress witnessed major discussions on the nationalization of land. Likewise, Brussels Congress in 1868 passed a resolution supporting the nationalization of land. It was decided that land would be leased out among the cooperatives of farmers instead of individual farmer. By contrast, the non-Marxists generally favored the idea of a self-sustained peasantry, since Marxists generally argued for the collective control of all means of production. It was but natural that they would support nationalization or collective ownership of land. However, the issue of nationalization of land does not find a crucial place in the early years of Marxist agrarian program. Yet the issue of private property in land has always been a contentious issue. Marxists have often debated if nationalization of land is consistent with socialism, or should one look at the issue merely from a pragmatic angle in terms of avoidance of fragmentation of land and having economies of scale to enable application of modern technology for enhanced agricultural production. But then such pragmatism would certainly feed capitalist tendencies in agriculture. Classes in agriculture, Lenin and Mao. Lenin was the first Marxist leader of repute who traced the growth of class differentiation within the cultivating peasantry under the regime of commodity production in a capitalist direction in his book, The Development of Capitalism in Russia, 1899. He analyzed the changing relations of the old lord-serf economy in the wake of formal abolition of serfdom in Russia. He looked at Russian agriculture at a time when Russian social structure was characterized by feudal production relations in a decline, when coexisting with and being replaced by developing capitalist relations. These conditions made Lenin privilege three indices for his characterization of class structure in the Russian agriculture: the extent and possession of land and other means of production, whether the household exploits others by hiring labor and taking rent, or is self-employed, that is itself exploited, the extent of being exploited or exploiting relative to the self-employment, and see if the household is unable to meet the subsistence requirements and is therefore enmeshed in usurious indebtedness, and whether it succeeds in obtaining a subsistence or produces a surplus available for investment. Based on these parameters, Lenin poses the following class structure in agriculture. Agricultural proletariat, they generally work at capitalist agricultural enterprises and as a rule survive by wage labor. Semi-proletarians or peasants, they own tiny plots of land, own or rented. They may be part of wage laborers as well. This is quite numerous class in agriculture. Small peasantry, they are small-scale tillers, owners or tenants. Generally, they produce enough for subsistence. They do not hire outside labor. In fact, according to Lenin, the majority of the rural poor belong to these three groups: agricultural proletariat, semi-proletarians and small peasantry. Middle peasants, they produce a certain surplus from their farm. They own some capital as well and go for employment of hired labor. In general, one farm out of two or three belongs to the middle peasant. Big peasants, they are capitalist entrepreneurs in agriculture and employed hired labor as a rule. They are connected with peasantry only in the lower cultural level habits of life, and manual labor they themselves perform on their farms. Big landowners, they exploit wage labor and small peasantry. They do not do any sort of manual labor. According to Lenin, they are rich financial magnates, exploiters and parasites. Thus, in Lenin's classification of agrarian classes, we find three related criteria: possession of land, basis of production with respect to labor, hiring versus self-employment, and associated levels of satisfaction of subsistence by the rural poor versus the production of surplus above subsistence which can be invested by rural exploiters. Another major influential work relating to the understanding of agrarian classes has been Mayer's work titled How to Differentiate Classes in Rural Areas. It is important to remember that Mayer was engaged in a revolutionary political project in the 1930s, and for him, identification of agrarian classes was preeminently a political exercise. However, scholars in the field of peasant studies have been heavily influenced by the works of Lenin and Mayer. It is only appropriate that we looked at Mayer's classification. Needless to add, Mayer's classification reflects the then prevailing conditions in agriculture in China, which were qualitatively different from those of Russia. According to Mayer, the following five-fold classification of peasants' classes can be thought of: landlords, they are engaged in the collection of land rent and have economic interest in lending, industry and commerce. They own land and do not engage in labor themselves. Rich peasants, they either own land or take rent. They have liquid capital and better instruments of production. They do engages in labor themselves but encourage various forms of exploitation, hiring of laborers, land rent, lending money, industry, commerce. Middle peasants, they can either own or take all the land they have on rent. They possess a fair number of farm implements and depend on their own labor. Generally, they do not sell the labor power. They do not exploit others, but they do get exploited through the payment of land rent and interest on land. Poor peasants, they have a few odd farm implements and hire themselves out. They get exploited through land rent and interest on loans, as well as through the sale of the part of their labor power. The workers have neither land nor any farm implements. They survive mainly or wholly by selling the labor power. We should notice that Mayer's analysis is much more in sync with the idea of pauperization rather than proletarianization. Mayer's main focus is on rent exploitation, whereas Lenin's focus is more on hiring of labor. The agrarian question in India. Under the overall influence of Marxism, scholars have elaborated on the agrarian question in India in relation to the political analysis and strategy of Marxist politics and Marxist agrarian political economy. Bryce and Bernstein have been in the forefront of the debate on the agrarian question in India. The scholarly interventions poses three issues regarding agrarian question. First, agrarian question is to be seen as a political issue. Second, it revolves around politics of class struggle and formation of strategic class alliances for the socialist transformation. That is to say, the task is to identify the right type of alliance among the urban poor, rural wage labor and poor peasantry for democracy and socialism. Lastly, it is about the place of agriculture in the transformation of society from agrarian to industrial. In other words, it is all about forms of agrarian transition. Evidently, there is no uniform roadmap for agrarian transition. As for Bryce argues, the countries of Europe have followed distinctive types of agrarian transition depending on their historical specificities. These differences arose from regional variations in terms of varying class-based relations in agriculture and their association with overall class dynamics. In the Indian case, it primarily means an assessment of the spread of capitalism in rural India. Besides, it is about the nature of class struggle and left politics. Conversely, the agrarian question is related to mapping out of the constraints for the development of capitalism in the countryside. Scholars like Amit Bahaduri, Nirmal Chandra, Pradhan Prasad, R.S. Rao see the existence of semi-feudal relations hampering the growth of capitalism in rural India. In semi-feudal relations, landlords lease out their land to poor peasants and provide credit to peasant. After the harvest, the landlord gets a lion's share of the produce and high rates of interest from the peasants. The peasants are always entrapped in perpetual indebtedness. However, landlords do not feel the need to go for intensive cultivation or capitalist mode of production. In fact, landlords have no incentive to invest. Daniel Thoner calls it the built-in depressor. Of course, there are scholars like Harris, Basu, Das who underline the decline of landlordism and diminishing control of landlords over the peasant. One also sees the signs of reverse tendency where large landholders who have the means to invest in agricultural production seek land on rent from small landholders. But this is a phenomenon restricted to Green Revolution areas. In general, small and marginal farmers do not depend on large farmers in the old way. The nature of family-managed farms has equally changed along the expansion of non-agricultural economy in rural India. Migration is an added variable. This does not, however, mean the complete transformation of the surplus labor of agriculture into working class or proletariat. According to Harris, agricultural laborers are only partially proletarianized because they try to keep agriculture as a security. Basu and Das are of the opinion that Indian agrarian system is no more semi-feudal in character. Land and labor are commoditized. Peasants sell their produce at the market and surplus is now generated in different ways, including capitalist profit, mercantile profit and interest on credit. Lurch looks at the agrarian question in the context of Green Revolution in Indian agriculture. According to him, surplus is accumulated by both the big and small capitalist farmers, even as the inequality between the large landowners and landlords has increased. The issue of bonded labor too figures prominently in these debates. Apparently, it is seen as a semi-feudal feature. However, Guren argues that bonded labor today is a capitalist phenomenon According to her, the bonded labor relations show the state of unfreedom, and unfreedom itself is a matter of capitalism. Debt bondage helps a capitalist to gain control over large, cheap labor force. Guerin's arguments support Harris's thesis mentioned earlier. On the other hand, Rao poses that Indian capitalism is canonical capitalism. It means that in Indian agriculture is subjugated by industrial production and wage labor relations. Lurch et al. Argue that capitalism in India has an historically defined route similar to the one followed in other parts of the world. It transforms existing pre-capitalist relations, at the same time makes selective use of the features of these relations. In essence, agrarian transition refers to the role of capitalist agriculture in industrial development. According to the classical agrarian transitional model, Bars argues that raw material, capital, labor, power come from agriculture for industrial development. On the other hand, large rural population constitutes market for industrial production. Now the question is whether a classical agrarian transition is still present under neoliberal globalization or not. In this context, McMakill argues that the main contradiction today is between the global corporate food regime, including multinational agribusiness monopolies and supermarkets, and peasantry. The small-scale agrarian production is subordinated to the international capital. Such contradiction disallow peasant differentiation and class formation within peasantry. On the contrary, Henry Bernstein argues that the classical agrarian question has lots of significance for capital. Under globalization, capital and commodity are no longer national as they have become international. Industrial development depends more on international investment and global markets. Therefore, the relation between national agriculture and national industry is irrelevant. Industrialization no longer depends on the capital accumulation and capital transfer from agriculture. Classical pattern of agrarian transition does not fit in with the Indian context. Industrial growth in India gets support from liberalization and globalization as international markets have opened up for investment. Therefore, industrialization in India does not require a prosperous capitalist agriculture to promote growth in the rest of the economy. In conclusion, we could see that this module had important issues that were raised. In this module, we discussed on the genealogy of a tradition. We also discussed about the classes in agriculture, especially in terms of the perspective of Lenin and Mayo. Further, very importantly, in this module, we also discussed the agrarian question in India. And in order to discuss the agrarian question in India, we took up a contrasting conceptualization, both in terms of peasant society and in terms of agrarian question. Further, we also discussed about conceptualization of a specific peasant economy in terms of the populism. Further, at the end, we discussed about the impact of capitalism on peasantry.